trainers, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, just your name and how you're connected to this work when I call on you. So we'll start with Stephen.
Hi, I'm Stephen Crippen. I am one of the priests at Grace Church, Bainbridge Island, and I've worked in our diocese for about 10 years now in congregational development circles, and I'm connected in that way.
Awesome. Ariane.
I'm Ariane Davison. I'm the canon to the ordinary for the Diocese of Olympia, which means I do whatever the bishop needs to be done on any given day. And I've been working with anti-racism and intercultural competency in our diocese for several years now, and I'm glad for you all to be here.
Awesome. Laura.
Hey y'all, glad to be with you. So my name is Laura, and I am down here in the Diocese of California. I'm a candidate to be a vocational deacon in the Episcopal Church, and I'm an IDI trainer. So glad to be here with y'all.
Awesome. Ivor.
Hi, I'm Ivor Hillsland. I'm the pastor at Church of the Apostles in the Fremont neighborhood of Seattle. And I've been doing work with the diocese for about 6 years around this stuff, and been doing IDI for maybe a year and a half, something like that.
Great. And Matt, why don't you introduce yourself and say why you're here with us? Got to unmute though.
There we go. Hey, Matt Koski. I'm the resource coordinator at the diocese, and I am here as your tech support or any weird Zoom things you have going on. I'm here. I'm here to support you.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. If you came in a little bit late and you haven't yet thrown your name and your congregation into the chat, please do that so we can see who is here. Welcome to all of you. And we'll start with a word of prayer. God be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Holy One, we are grateful for the opportunity to learn, to examine our own places in the world, and to gain skills to do a better job of reaching across to other cultures, understanding the situations of people who experience the world differently than us. Holy One, we long for a world where there is justice and equality, and we ask your blessing on our time as we do some of the work that we hope will help us be part of your dream. We love you. Amen. Awesome. All right, Stephen, you want to help us with some norms for our time together this morning?
So if you've done work with us around congregational development, some of these norms will look familiar, but we've tweaked them a little bit so that they are a better match for our current context. So we strive to arrive and end on time, both sides of that, so that you can trust that this process will still give you your afternoon and allow you to build your day with us. We ask you to be here when you're here and to minimize distractions and to stay with us as much as you can. Our goal is to listen, to understand, and to act. So we're not listening so that, we're not waiting for someone else to stop talking so that we can start talking. Instead, we're listening to really understand what people are saying so that we can act differently and responsibly to them. Try something new, experiment with something, and make mistakes and learn from them. So for some of us, trying something new might look like speaking when we normally would be quiet. For others, it's the opposite. It might be, the new thing might be to step back so that others can share and so that we can learn from them. We're also modeling mistake making. So a lot of this intercultural work has to do with us making mistakes and learning from them rather than so conscientiously trying to avoid doing something wrong. Notice your own resistance and get curious about it. So you may feel like you want to get off the call or step away in your consciousness. Just notice that and get curious about why you might be resisting. Be the change that you want to see. And so you're primarily learning how to intervene with yourself in this process and work more flexibly with your own stuff. Confidentiality, take only your own story home. So people might share things that are sensitive or close to the bone or just personal information about themselves. Make sure that you don't take that with you in your conversations with others. Practice empathy for BIPOC, so for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and also empathy with others who have white privilege and with yourself. We're all in this and working with some material that is sensitive and difficult. Practice grace and patience with others who are dealing with technology and with Zoom. So please don't shout, "You are muted," you know? Be sensitive and kind to one another as we are trying to work in this environment. We also may experience freeze-ups of Wi-Fi, and so we just need to be patient with each other while we work through that stuff. And please hold everyone in your prayers at all levels, including yourself. Some other procedural norms include mute yourself when you're in plenary. So when you're sharing, of course, you would unmute, but when we're all here in the same room together, make sure that you're muted. But then unmute yourself in small groups. So we've learned that when we're in small groups, if our default setting is unmuted, it allows for a freer conversation. And keep your own video on if possible. It's just better if we can see you and know you're here in that more direct way. So those are some of our norms for our work today.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephen. All right. So if you are here, I hope it is because you want to be part of our diocesan efforts to dismantle structural racism in our diocese and in our world. And that is the big idea of what we're doing here together. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what our approach as a diocese is. So we're going to screen share. We are starting this in a couple different areas. So we've done our opening prayer. Here's our approach to anti-racism. We are working from the belief that with God's help, we can repent of the sin of racism and build a more just and equitable church. So this is our goal. You can keep them going, Ariane. Our first priority as a diocese is the people who have been harmed and who are currently being harmed. So that's Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So the efforts that we've done, we started with them. The first meeting we had, the first Navigating a Changing Church meeting we had was only for BIPOC people and was mostly about space to air pain and hurt, and for us to discover where are we doing harm right now and how can we stop it as quickly as possible. And then we moved into the next group of people that we are focusing on are white folks who are coming to this work with different agendas, different levels of skill, and in different developmental places. So one of the things we're just aware of on a deep level is that not everyone has experience in this area. And not everyone knows what to do or what to say, or not everyone thinks the same things are true when it comes to the realities of racism in our culture and in our country. So we want to focus on equipping our white folk to develop both understanding and the concrete skills needed to participate safely and effectively in dismantling racism. We have noticed that for those of us who are white and who have not had a lot of experience with people who are different than us, ethnically, racially, in other ways, we don't always have the language and skills that we need to have the tough conversations about understanding and building bridges between the reality of being a white person and the reality of not being a white person in our country. So we've decided to start with intercultural communication skill development. It is hard to truly hear someone whose experience is different than you if you don't have communication skills to understand and bridge those differences. So we're beginning with intercultural communication. And we want to equip you, this is the beginning of it, to equip all of us to be competent in intercultural communication. And there's a few factors that come into play for that. Basically, knowledge, motivation, and skill, right? So knowledge is about your information about the culture group. What do you know about the group that you're trying to communicate with or for? And you can increase your knowledge in lots of ways, by watching movies, by reading books, by having conversations with someone who's culturally different than you, by going to cultural events. Motivation. And motivation is our big one today, a lot of what we're talking about, which is your intentions and your emotional response to intercultural communication. Many of us have had positive experiences with people of other cultures. And you may notice that when you have a positive experience of someone who's different than you want to learn more and you want to get better at connecting to that person. Some of us have also had negative experiences across difference. And you might, if you think about that, notice that if you have had a really negative experience, for example, in a conversation about racism, you might not want to have another conversation about racism. It might decrease your motivation. So we are hoping to help increase all of us, our motivation in engaging in intercultural communications by understanding more of how our cultures work and by reflecting on what's positive about being able to communicate with people who don't share your same life experience. And then finally, skill, your ability to perform effective and appropriate behaviors. And again, skills is one of those things that you get through practice. Almost no one is completely skilled at something the first time they try to do it. So the way that, Ariane was talking a little bit earlier, or Stephen was talking earlier about trying new things and not being okay with messing up. Skill is a practical development that happens through trying and learning from mistakes, which is part of what all of us need to do in order to get better at having these conversations and communicating interculturally. So in this session today, this hour and a half that we have together, we're going to talk about something called the Intercultural Development Continuum, which is a framework for understanding how we develop skills in communicating with people who are different than we are. And we're going to talk about how to use this intercultural development continuum as we engage with others around issues of race and culture and similarity and difference. So how does this help us be less racist? How does this help us dismantle structural racism? So now we're going to do our best to show you one of those videos about culture.
In his book, Beyond Culture, Edward T. Hall developed the iceberg analogy of culture. The cultural iceberg theory suggests that, like an iceberg, there are some aspects of culture which are visible or which, in other words, lie above the surface of the water. These can include language, food, greetings, art, music, and many others. These are the explicit manifestations of culture. They are easy to see, taste, or hear. But according to Hall's theory, these are only the tip of the iceberg. The majority of culture, like an iceberg, lies beneath the surface. These aspects are not immediately visible. They can include worldview, religion, spiritual beliefs, decision-making models, power relationships, respect for authority, concepts of time, and many others. These are the implicit manifestations of culture. They can exert an important influence over behavior, values, feelings, and thoughts. The more immersed we become in a cultural environment, the more these hidden aspects are revealed to us.
So I'll step in here and just emphasize again the iceberg model and how it helps us understand culture. So there are things that we can see readily when we enter a culture. When you walk into a church, for example, you see artifacts, the visual artifacts, and words and actions that say something about that culture. But what you might not see is unspoken beliefs or other dimensions of culture that are less available to your own sight, and also perhaps less available to the consciousness of the people in that culture. So for example, Is this the kind of culture that starts meetings when the time begins that they said they would start the meeting? Or do they start their meetings when everyone who is important to be at that meeting has arrived? So that would be an example of how unseen things can happen in cultures, or there are assumptions or relationships or interaction patterns that are operating under the waterline. And those are harder to see, not only for people outside the culture, but for people within it.
So this is work that comes from Ed Schein, who looks at sort of what culture is for and why we have it. And he proposes that groups create culture to solve two major problems. One being external adaptation. So how do we respond to outside threats? How do we respond to change? And culture helps us cope with those things. And then the other is internal integration. So how do we know who is us? How do we create a sense of belonging? How do we have people who we care for, who we're in relationship with? And he proposes that culture helps us solve both of these challenges, and that is what culture is for. Beth Zemsky offers us another definition. She is someone who works very closely on the IDI and trains folks in it. And she says that culture can be defined as just the way we do things around here, right? So a way of capturing that whole iceberg of things that we can see and things that are more intangible. So culture is the accumulated learnings of a group that have made them successful, right, in solving both those problems of external adaptation and internal integration. And it can be as difficult to speak about as for a fish to talk about water, right? Culture is the world that we swim in. And as Stephen said, much of it goes unnamed and unexplicit. It is mostly invisible to us as we move through it because it's simply a set of our expectations about how things are going to go around here. And culture is only fully understood by its own members, right? So all of those intangible experiences that you can be immersed in are only fully understood from inside that culture. So it can be looked at and better understood from an outside perspective, but is only fully grasped by those who are part of it. Finally, culture is deep, broad, and stable. Right? These are things that are very challenging to change, partly because of that original purpose of helping groups adapt to outside change and threat. Culture is made to be the bedrock on which we base our interactions. And therefore it is a firm foundation that is hard to move.
So what we're talking about today and getting used to and beginning to work with is intercultural competence, which is the how, how do we build skill and awareness of within ourselves so that we can deepen and expand our competency in working with other cultures. So we're focusing on the capability to shift cultural perspective and adapt or bridge behavior to cultural commonality and difference, both commonality and difference. And so what we're working on here is deep cultural self-awareness. So I become aware of dimensions of my own culture, and then I build understanding of the experiences of people from different cultural communities in perceptions, values, beliefs, behavior, and practices. An example of this might be that I, Stephen, personally know how to behave and who I am as a boy in an Irish family. I know what that's like, and I'm very skillful in it, but only recently have I become more aware of how that plays itself out and how that's also not the experience of other families. Or I might be more aware now than I used to be of how my white privilege opens doors for me and also closes those doors for others, or how my dominant US culture favors direct engagement and achievement. Those are cultural values that I was given almost unthinkingly, and they are not universal. And so this brings us to the intercultural development continuum. And the key ideas along this continuum are that our experiences shape intercultural development. And so, if I grew up in a 99+% white community in Southwest Minnesota, And that experience shapes my development. It limits my development, and it also offers opportunities for my development. Our developmental orientations are not a moral judgment. And so as we go through this continuum in the next few moments, try to let go of the anxiety that you might have about being labeled or put in a certain place on the continuum. This is a way of understanding intercultural competency that steps back from labeling and moral judgments about ourselves or others, and just sees how wherever we are on the continuum, we are able to be functional and aware, and we're able to deepen and expand our awareness and abilities. Awareness of our developmental orientation, it helps us identify new experiences and skills that would help us in our ministry, individually and organizationally. So what we're going to reflect on later today is how are my own experiences and my own skills development, how are they giving me more options in my situations to act differently and to act with more skill and awareness. So here's the continuum. And as you zero in on this and let it wash over you, you can see that the continuum moves us gradually from a monocultural mindset to an intercultural mindset. And you may find yourself anywhere on this continuum. And also you may be able to discern how you're already leaning into another place on it. And so we'll go through these in detail in the coming slides. But what we're moving from here is how we interact with difference, how we engage with it, how we understand it, and how we build skills. And so if we're in a denial mindset, a monocultural mindset of denial, we tend to miss difference. We just don't see a difference between myself and another person, or between my culture and another person's culture. As we move into polarization, we'll start to look at how we begin to judge difference. So we're noticing difference, but we're making judgments about it. In minimization, we de-emphasize difference, and we tend to identify what we have in common with those who are in different cultures. This is not bad or wrong, it's not evil. It's just a mindset and a set of skills and a way of approaching the world that has some advantages to us, but also has some limitations. As we move into acceptance, we're starting to really understand that my culture is not a universal culture, that there are other cultures, and that they answer questions and solve problems differently than I would have expected. And finally, in adaptation, we start to build bridges across difference and gain skills and abilities to interact with people from other cultures with deeper awareness.
I wonder if maybe Laura might share a bit about how those different, how people progress along that continuum in terms of similarity, since this is a model that looks at similarity and differences. Maybe you could add something more to that, Laura.
Yeah, thanks, Ariane. So moving throughout the continuum, right, as Stephen said, is all about gaining additional skills and knowledge of other cultures. And so from a denial mindset, there might be an assumption that all people are similar, right, because it misses difference entirely. In polarization, there's a real struggle to see similarities across lines of difference, right? That really highlights difference as the predominant thing that you're paying attention to. And so the move into minimization is reconnecting with that sense of similarity, looking often for shared values, how to be on the same page with somebody. What are things that you can agree to? Where does your experience relate to someone else's, right? A lot of that grasping for how do I understand you from my own framework? What is similar about us? How do we connect on that level? Acceptance is then a shift back into recognizing that not all things are similar, right? Acknowledging cultural differences where they exist, but still retaining from minimization that basic respect that you're able to develop for other people, right? So recognizing shared humanity and value, even as you're understanding that somebody is on a different cultural iceberg than you are. And adaptation then being the place to bridge across that difference to again find commonality and shared experiences. So the ability to participate collectively and have shared understanding, shared interpretations of events, and really build commonality that celebrates both of those differences and doesn't need to erase them, but allows people to still be in common spaces, to be in community with one another, and to have some shared analysis of what we're doing and some shared values about why we're all here together in this space. So now we're going to share a little bit more about specifically each orientation, and we'll give you a little bit more of a definition and some examples relevant to our current situation of, like, if you're in this orientation, how you might be responding to what's happening in our political sphere right now.
So we'll first explore denial a little bit. And again, this is about missing differences. It's an orientation that notices cultural differences that are easily seen, like food and clothing, but not the deeper differences. So an example of this would be, you can see that someone is wearing a stole that was sewn in one of the countries of Africa, but you may not understand anything deeper about that culture or about their rituals. So typical responses to denial include, like, turning off the news or focusing on people closest to me to self-soothe. And there are times when turning off the news is a fundamental of self-care, but this is a more pervasive practice of, when I encounter conflict that is centered around culture, I tend to bounce off of that or recoil from that or try to stay out of that. And a developmental opportunity here is to turn the news on and begin to wonder why people are so mad. I was recently in a conversation where some people I know who have white privilege were complaining about how riots and looting had so devastated downtown Seattle. And instead is to just get curious about why people would be so upset that all of this is going on. And so that's just a quick look at denial.
So the next orientation on the continuum from denial is polarization, which judges difference. So this is when you're standing on your iceberg and you have a very clear sense of this is us and everybody else is them. And it judges that difference, right? That can show up in a couple of different ways. So there's a defense orientation to polarization, which is the orientation that us is good, them is bad. And then there's its inverse, right? So a reversal orientation of us is bad, them is good, right? And sort of, this is where you find stereotypes and the assertion that you can make a blanket positive or negative judgment about another culture. This is where you might hear, like, if I know one thing about you, I know everything I need to know about who you are and where you're coming from. Typical responses to George Floyd's murder and the current uprising and police violence that might come in a defense polarization orientation are, why are those people causing trouble? From a person of color perspective, why are police allowed to murder people with impunity? From a white perspective, how does the murder of a community member entitle somebody to loot? Right? So just sort of this entrenched oppositional understanding of one another. And the developmental opportunity here is to try to remain connected to a diverse group of people. As you notice yourself distancing from who that other is, from that them, to consider what your group has in common with the other side. For the opposite inflection, for the reversal orientation of polarization, so that's the negative attitude towards one's own culture and the positive estimation of another. Why isn't my group behaving better? Why are some of my people looting? Or why are my people mistreating protesters? Depending on what perspective you're coming to that conversation from. So it's a negative assumption about one's own, a negative judgment about one's own culture. And the developmental opportunity there is to remain connected again to a diverse group of people and to consider what your group has in common with the other side. So where can we start to build some of those bridges across this us versus them and break down an overly simplistic assertion about someone's goodness or badness based on what group they are a member of?
So minimization, there's a hymn in our hymnal that people love and sing and should sing, but it goes like this. In Christ there is no east or west, in him no south or north, but one great fellowship of love throughout the whole wide earth. That's true. It's also a stance of minimization, where we underplay differences in favor of we're all one big community. So this minimization is an orientation that highlights similarities and universal values in a way that can miss and mask important differences. I see two icebergs. Let's try to avoid hitting them. So in minimization, typical responses to the murder of George Floyd and the protests and police violence include, why can't we all just get along? And let's restore order and then talk about what's wrong. I heard a priest, not in this state, say this very thing. We need to really get law and order back on the table, and then we can talk about what's wrong. The developmental opportunity in this particular orientation is to reflect on why someone might prefer chaos and disorder to the status quo. What experiences might they have had that this seems better? So it's getting in touch, for example, with how the way things used to be were really terrible for a good number of people. And so what looked like stability and calm and the world makes sense to some is a place of deep pain and chaos for others. And also to ask the question, what part of my culture contributed to this problem? That's a non-defensive stance kind of question. What part of my culture contributed to this problem? And what parts of my culture could make the situation better? And so it's not bad or wrong or evil to have a minimization stance. It's just a place where we can do some good, but we can also ask questions that take us deeper.
So the move from minimization that we look for developmentally is into acceptance. So moving from a place of de-emphasizing difference and over-assuming commonality to a space that can accurately recognize and deeply understand cultural differences where they matter. So this is where you see this person has, in their boat, gotten over to the other iceberg and is maybe starting to look around, starting to get immersed in some of that cultural understanding of a culture that is not their own, an orientation that recognizes and appreciates other cultures. So if this is the developmental orientation that you're bringing or that's prevalent in your congregation, you're probably reading and talking to a lot of people about what's going on, and you might be feeling paralyzed and unsure about what to do about it. Right? I talk about acceptance all the time as being often a very awkward phase because you can see the challenges and you aren't yet in adaptation where you know how to bridge across them. Often the tendency here is to slide back into minimization because it is uncomfortable, right? Because there can be conflict here, there can be putting your foot in your mouth, there can be a lot of messing up. And so there's a desire often to slide back into minimization and continue to de-emphasize difference rather than to grapple with it. So the developmental opportunity here is to explore ways of processing the information and making a judgment of what you think should happen next based on both your culture and the needs of others, right? The needs of the Black community, the needs of police, and figuring out how to get out of some of that analysis paralysis and get comfortable with taking action.
And then we find our way to adaptation, which builds bridges across differences. It's an orientation capable of shifting perspectives and changing behavior in culturally appropriate ways. So I can see a difference and I can work effectively with it. Okay, so typical responses to the murder of George Floyd and protests and police violence, if you're in adaptation, include checking in with friends and loved ones to help them navigate feelings and thoughts, and refocusing existing work to integrate the events that have happened. Developmental opportunities include being patient with everybody else. They don't have the skills that you have to deal with this. That's a really big piece of adaptation. And also includes maybe being willing to interact skillfully with folks who don't have your skills. Being gentle with yourself, maintaining your energy level while you spend more time than usual focused on others' experiences of these events. So again, adaptation is not the mountain that God's chosen people stand on. It's a stance in which we can interact with everybody with skill. So another lens for understanding this continuum, and I'm going to engage Alyssa on this to help me with some examples, is to look at the continuum moving from monocultural mindset to an intercultural mindset in terms of a male Me Too response. And so I have male privilege, and if I am in denial around cultural differences related to sex, I might not see the problem. I might not see that women experience the world in ways that are fundamentally different than my experience. I might just miss the difference. As I move into polarization, I might want to help women adapt to the system that is comfortable for me. So I might want them to take on behaviors and clothing and ritual behaviors that help them adapt to a male-dominated culture. As I move into minimization, I start to treat women as I would expect to be treated. Alyssa, what might be an example of this?
Of minimization?
Yeah.
Well, when we were talking about this earlier, and I was thinking about a lot of the conversations around labor in the home that I have with other women, such as myself, who are partnered with men. And, you know, a minimization example for that might be if I come home, and this is a hypothetical, just to be clear, but it may have happened. I come home and after a long day of work, and our dishes are done, but the counters are not clean. And I might say to my spouse, "Why didn't you wash down the counters at the end of the day?" And he might say, "Oh, I don't care about that. It's okay. We don't have to do the counters." Right? But I happen to know that if my mother-in-law comes over tomorrow, I'm gonna get business for the counters not being cleaned off, right? And he's just saying like, "Oh, it's okay. I don't care about the counters, so I don't expect you to care about the counters, but I care about them," to be clear.
As I move into acceptance, I strive to learn the culture that my behaviors create for women. My behavior has impact on women that I might not readily see at first, or there might be consequences for choices I make that will be experienced by women and not by men. So Alyssa.
Actually, I think this is a place where I see, and again, I'm going to go back to heterosexual marriage partnerships or permanent partnerships in the home. A lot of my male friends, where they get it, they understand that their wives are doing more emotional labor than them. They understand all of that, and they just are like, they don't know what to do. Like, they've read all the think pieces about it, but they want to be good partners and they want to be good men, but they don't know what to do about it other than just know it.
And finally, in adaptation, I will model and hold others accountable to model behaviors respectful of women. One example of this would be, my boss is a woman in a culture and in a system where she is doing a traditionally man's job. She's the rector of a congregation. And so I'm just watching. So when we are both on a Zoom call with the vestry and somebody says something nice about me or complimentary of me, I wonder about it. I get curious about it. Do they speak that way to the rector? Do they recognize that her contribution precedes mine? She was in the system for a couple of years before I was. And I just notice and model behaviors that are respectful toward her. And so if I, for example, another example of that would be if I pay her a compliment, how does that come across? What's being said when I do that? How are there ways in which I interact with her that model a better way of interacting between men and women? Or are there ways in which I might fail at that and can work on that? Any other examples, Alyssa, on adaptation in this model?
I think it's being able to, in our home, not that my spouse is necessarily in adaptation, but he has taken on all of the school tasks for our family. So he's chosen to track the girls' homework. We have 2 elementary school age children, to be the person who contacts their teachers, to make sure they have food for lunches, and all of that, which is a lot of emotional labor. And I feel like deep in his understanding is the knowledge that teachers expect moms to do that. and that there's a cultural expectation for women to be the ones who are doing all that stuff for kids. So he'll send me text messages. This is pre-COVID. He would text message me each morning if he was at work to say, it's library day for this kid. This kid has PE today. Make sure she's wearing, make sure she's not wearing heels. You know, this kid has, and so he would do that extra work for me so that all I had to do was like get them out the door. And that's an adaptation behavior for men, I think, into female culture.
So once more, this is the overview of the continuum. We're going to take questions at the end of the whole session, so you can be putting questions about the continuum in chat as we go if you have them. But this is just once more to view sort of that scope of development from a monocultural mindset to an intercultural mindset and where we might find ourselves along the way. This is from a 2016 study of the US population of each percentage in each orientation. So you can see that there's a strong majority in minimization, and this works as a bell curve with roughly equal proportions in polarization and acceptance, and then few people in denial and fewer in adaptation. So this is what sort of the spectrum looks like of where people are most likely to be in the United States. And here are results from your own Diocese of Olympia. So these are aggregate results as of June of this year. And this is a self-selecting sample of folks who decided affirmatively to take the IDI. But you can see relatively similar results, right? Slightly more weighted towards acceptance and adaptation, which we would expect, rather than polarization and denial, which is not surprising for a self-selected sample of folks who were interested and excited to engage in this work, that they have probably done some work on their own developmental stages around intercultural relationship and communication.
Okay, we are going to go very quickly through this part because I do want to get us into our breakout groups to talk about things. But these are just some ideas, and as you learn more about this, one of the challenges that we will all face, and all of us, if you're in this Zoom room, you are a minister in the church. You are someone who models and leads people in maturing their Christian faith. And figuring out what Christian faith looks like when it becomes behavior. So here's just some ideas about how to meet people where they are developmentally and to talk about racism, depending on the developmental orientation of the people you are ministering with or ministering to.
So one of the key strategies when you think along that continuum is that what is most important and helpful for the person in their development is thinking that next step up on the continuum. So for someone in denial, you want them to begin making those judgments. Remember, polarization judges difference. So you want them to begin making judgments about other cultures in order them to move towards polarization. So that means articulating how culture influences their behavior, beginning to actually see that they do things in a particular way that's different than others, asking questions about their views on people different from themselves. So really investigative, really opening themselves up to that difference, encouraging them to wonder why people might be made by God mad or upset. Why would they be mad about these things? What is it behind all that, and what is different about them that leads to that behavior and that emotion? And then lastly, helping folks manage their anxiety so they don't feel compelled to withdraw. It's as we open ourselves to more and more difference, we start to realize and question things about how we do stuff and have those, and that can be a hard thing for us to deal with. So we have to manage and cope with that anxiety as we work forward.
Yeah, Josh has a great question in chat about picturing an adult in the denial stage. I think I have a really close relative, and again, this is not, these are not, there's no judgment on where you are. Good, mature, intelligent, lovely people just who haven't had a chance to be exposed to a lot of difference in their lives are in denial. So one of my close relatives who's a fantastic human being and a deeply faithful Christian, their response to what happened with George Floyd is very much as described. Talking on the phone with them, they're like, I don't watch the news because it's really hard. And this is all really crazy. I'm just gonna check out because they just haven't thought deeply about cultural difference in those ways. I think that many of the adults in our lives are in denial just because they haven't had the chance to encounter difference. Hopefully that's helpful, Josh. You'll have more chance to talk about this more in small group too. In polarization, people in polarization, what you want for these folks is for them to begin to find commonality between themselves and those that are different. They're looking ahead to minimization, right? So you might look for providing direct experience with people who are from other cultures. So it's not just theoretical for them anymore. And to help them see similarities. Look, you might say, I might say to my white parishioners about my parishioners who are from South Sudan, look how everyone loves their children. Look how everyone gets super mad at their children sometimes, right? We have commonalities to help them see it, and to really focus on decreasing the fear and increasing empathy, which is critical for a congregation or a human's ability to move out of polarization toward minimization.
So then as we start to think about the people in our context who are in minimization or the organization as a whole, we want to then again be thinking towards the acceptance, the emphasis of that difference and the value of that difference. So wanting people to get curious about their own and other cultures and beginning to articulate differences without going into us versus them. So addressing blind spots, but emphasizes the importance of empathetic listening to encourage a greater awareness and integrity of self-group identity. So these are really important to always remember that the work we are doing in this stage is really thinking not only of our exposure to other cultures, but really an examination of why we do things the way we do them and why are those different than others. A development of cross-cultural experiences and skills, so beginning to actually try things on, experiment with that, and helping people to become more comfortable in identifying those differences and talking about it and learning about it.
Yeah, if you're in minimization, it can feel really scary to even say that something is different out loud. It can feel like potentially you could screw it up, and you could, but that's how we learn. If you're working with folks in acceptance, you want them to educate themselves and receive feedback so that they can appropriately adapt behavior. So with your acceptance folks, you're helping them to actually start to do things, to do actions, to try to build bridges, and then giving feedback so that they can understand what to do, how to improve. So it's about recognizing how culture operates in their particular context and how it might adapt for those that aren't in primary culture. Having concrete outreach and experiences with intercultural community groups. So in my congregation, we have a group of people who are from South Sudan that worship in our space, and there's a lot of crossover. One of the things that my congregation really needed was opportunities for white folks from our Sunday morning congregation to visit the Saturday evening South Sudanese group. And then not just to visit, but to process what they had experienced there. And some formal presentations where they can gain in-depth knowledge about patterns of cultural difference and talk with other people about it. So building community in those ways is important for acceptance folks.
And just
also feedback is vital. What was that, Ivor?
Oh, sorry, you had one more. I didn't notice.
I wasn't sure either. But yeah, feedback is just because in acceptance, people are starting to try to do things, to do behaviors, and they're not usually very confident about it. So they need to be told when they're doing a good job, and they also need to be told when their behaviors need to stop or to be different or to be tweaked.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that we exist up in our brain a lot in the acceptance category and cognitive understanding of that difference. So like Liz was saying, getting feedback and behavior and really practicing skills becomes really vital to our development from acceptance into adaptation.
I just would note, we don't have a slide for talking to people about racism when they're in adaptation. That doesn't mean that people in adaptation are perfect at being anti-racist. What we can do with folks who are in adaptation is notice them and notice that they're probably worn out. It is a challenge to be especially in a congregational system, but to be in any system and to be in a developmentally different place than everyone else is a challenge. So we can help our folks in adaptation, or if you're in adaptation, by noticing again those energy levels, helping them to find a way to interact with others. So sometimes people in adaptation can just become very frustrated because they're like, everyone else sucks here and I can't talk to them. And so like helping them to figure out how can you connect with people at different levels of development. How can you understand the contexts of others so that you know why they are where they are is helpful. And just because someone is in adaptation doesn't mean that they're going to love it if they get feedback that they're not doing well. Being in adaptation with one culture doesn't mean you're in adaptation with every culture that you encounter. All right, we're a little late going into breakout groups, but I think our groups will be a little smaller. So we're going to split up into groups. You'll have either me or Ivor or Ariane or Stephen or Laura facilitating your small group. And we're going to look at these questions, kind of thinking about a time when you developed a skill that you're proud of, because again, we're talking about skill development here. And then to talk about motivation. What motivates you for this work? Why did you come to this today? What emotional responses to particular situations have propelled you to do work to dismantle racism? And are there any demotivating experiences that you also are holding as we begin this work and skill development together? All right, trainers, anything to add before we go to groups?
Just remember, unmute yourself in the group so that the conversation goes more smoothly.
Great. All right, whisk us away. Welcome back. This is a quote by James Baldwin: "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." Which is a kind of good thing, I think, to think about. All right, so what I would like to do, we're going to talk a little bit about next steps, and also if you have burning questions, go ahead and throw them into the chat, and we'll try to get to them as well in our sort of last 10 minutes. This is the intro. This is the first step, right? So this is a navigating a changing church, session 1. This is the beginning of a journey and nowhere near the end of one. I don't know if there is an end to this journey that I'm going to see in my lifetime. So next steps to consider: continue to work on your own knowledge, motivation, and skill. Remember, these are keys to intercultural competency. So what do you need to know more about? How to keep motivating yourself. I just want to flag too that for many of us, especially those of us who are white, we start with motivations that have to do with shame and guilt. And that in the big picture, these are difficult motivations to maintain because they don't feel good. Right? I mean, there's value, I think, to being in touch with your own guilt and to be in touch with the shame. Those are real feelings and they're valid. But let's find some other motivations too, right? That when we're more likely to be motivated by things like hope, by love, opportunities to know and love people who are different than us and want better for them. And so guilt and shame will only get us so far and often end up flipping on us and being demotivators because it just can be exhausting. So just something to observe and to notice about your own self and the motivations that you're bringing. Consider taking the intercultural development inventory. This is, you can, Mary Ellen, I see your question there. You can take it by emailing Matt. Yep, Laura's got it. So email Matt, let him know, and one of our qualified administrators will be in touch with you. And you'll be able to take it and we'll debrief you. So what happens is it takes like, I don't know, 30, 40 minutes to get through the inventory. And then you will have a meeting with someone who's a qualified administrator. So any of us trainers who are on here, there's some other folks, we have a team of them, and they'll meet with you these days, likely on Zoom, to debrief your results and help you understand. And one of the great things is that along with the report on where you are, where that you're assessed to be in your development, you also get a plan that helps you figure out what's next for you. Because again, this doesn't, you can know where you are and stay there forever. Like my approach to running, I'm a beginning runner. I realized recently after like my 17th time doing the first 3 weeks of Couch to 5K that I'm happy with my developmental stage as a beginning runner, and I shall not be progressing further in my development. This is possible with this too, but also there's things you can do to develop. We are going to be having a next session, a session 2 of navigating a changing church. So I think we'll do one more, session 1. So keep an eye out when you see this stuff come through. You're the second group that's done this first session. So we're gonna do 3 of them. And then we'll have a next step. We're gonna talk about, okay, now what? This has been a lot about motivation, and we'll be working on something else together. So come to that. Keep an eye out for that. It'll be either late fall or early winter quarter. And also, please keep praying. Please keep praying for our diocese, for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, humans in our nation, and all who engage in this work, all who come to this table, with a desire for this to happen. Josh, this session will be, so I think the plan, we're recording this, and after we've done the next session 1, we'll release it. So when we're ready to move to having session 2 of Navigating a Changing Church, this will be available. So folks who want to jump in on that can watch it before coming. That's the current plan. Ariane, anything you want to add?
I just wanted to actually know if we wanted to take questions before praying, or if we wanted to pray, release folks, and then let anyone who wants to stay for 10 minutes ask questions.
Well, we can see if we have any. We have 5 minutes before
Okay.
closure, and it doesn't take 5 minutes to say the Lord's Prayer. So,
Okay.
So why don't we unshare? Are there any questions for clarification, things you don't understand, or pressing questions? You can put them into chat. You could unmute and ask them if you're brave enough to do that.
We had one question in our group we just didn't have time to get to. It was about, particularly with an election coming up, around polarization and strategies of how to have conversations or deal with people who think very differently than us, or might have very different political views.
Yeah. So one of the ways this theory works is that when we're under stress, we can slide backwards in our development, right? This happens, in many skill sets. Right? Like if you're a really good swimmer and you're having a horrible day, you might slide back and develop sort of a bad habit into a bad habit you've had before, or into an earlier phase of your development. So it is pretty likely that many of us will feel pressure to fall backwards. When I first took the intercultural development inventory, they used to assess something called a trailing orientation. And I had a trailing orientation in polarization reversal. Right? Yeah, polarization reversal, which I was able to trace to the fact that that this was right around the time of when killing of Black children, in particular by white police officers, was starting to really hit the news. And I have Black children, so I was, I was sliding backwards and getting really kind of polarized about that issue, which didn't help me or my children, as a matter of fact. So knowing that people do not behave their best under stress, and we're all about to be under a lot of stress, is good to know. Another thing I just noticed this time through kind of the slides was how much being curious and non-defensive was helpful, no matter what development of where the person you're talking to is in their development, right? So I don't know how helpful. I was thinking about that, like how often. My particular tendency, I usually don't get into fights with people unless I'm related to them. So like all my fights happen with my family of origin around politics, and I'm just less likely to be like, oh, I wonder what's going on with that with them. So thinking through some of those dynamics could be helpful as well. Other trainers, ideas about that?
I think just that, to keep in mind the next developmental step from polarization. So if we are at conflict over something, to think around minimization as a strategy for how we have those, which can be difficult if we really want us to be talking at it from the other side of an us-them thing, but really finding those commonalities and similarities can be an effective strategy with relatives who are different or things like that, really focusing on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see what other questions have come out. There's some great stuff about trainings that are coming up. Any insights to share from the BIPOC session with BIPOC members of our community? We're gonna find ways to share them. I believe I wasn't there, not being in that category, but that one of the promises we made was that was a safe space for them to say and do whatever they wanted. and needed to do. And so we're not sharing out or publicizing any of those things. Is that correct, Ariane?
Yeah, so what we've done is kind of create conversation. That was a conversation space, and actually there's a group that's been gathering ethnic ministries and circles of color folk and incorporating people who attended that event so that they have a safe space to talk about how they've experienced both kind of racism in the world, but also in our church specifically. And so what we know is that it's actually going to take us some time for them to feel like it's safe enough to share that direct feedback with the diocese. And we're all a part of that feedback, actually. And then also, we wanted to give, I have a goal that we have some time also while that work is happening to chat with folks like you who came to this event who want to be ready for that conversation and to make it as an effective and appropriate and helpful conversation as possible. So what we determined is actually we're just honestly not ready quite yet in terms of trust. And so we're going to take some moves at convention. The convention, diocesan convention this year is going to include conversations on some resolutions about systemic changes we might make. So we're going to talk about those. We're also going to talk and experience some prayer that helps us connect to that feeling of lament and maybe help us process some of that shame so that we can turn it into hope and collaboration. But know that this is going to take a really long time because the sin that we enacted has been happening for, for centuries. Like, so we walked away from each other and God for centuries. And so we're not going to be able to come back together like just because it feels better. It's going to take us some time to journey back to a place where we're together and doing mission and ministry again. But I think we're going to get there, actually. So please participate. The best thing we can do is show up and work on this together.
Absolutely. And with that being said, Ariane, would you lead us in the Lord's Prayer?
Sure. And so I'm going to say the version, the old-timey version that's in my heart, but you, especially muted, can say whatever version that Jesus gave you to pray this prayer that he taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
All right, thank you. Todd, I see your question. The circles, the circles of color ministries and the groups that are specialized that are happening, that's all on our diocesan website, I believe, including contact information. If there's more questions, you can throw them up there. If not,
if you are not sure how to access that group, you can also contact me directly and I'd be happy to put you in touch with that group. So that's true for anyone who's still here. If you're a Black person, Indigenous person, or person of color who'd like to be a part of those groups, let me know and I'll connect you.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you everyone for coming and being willing to show up and bring yourselves to this work and do this work.